Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's concert. I'm your host, Tom Cook, and the band just opened this evening's performance with a piece titled American Fanfare by John Wasson. The work was originally composed for the Dallas Brass, a well-known professional brass quintet, and then rearranged by the composer for concert band. Our concert theme tonight is Songs and Dances. And we're off to a running start with what is certain to be an enjoyable and inspiring program. We're so happy that you decided to join us tonight. Again tonight, the band is under the direction of Don Jaramillio. Please welcome Mr. Don Jaramillio. Any of you who played in high school or college band are likely to be familiar with the next piece on tonight's program. It's a well-known work and a standard for wind band by one of England's most famous composers, Vaughan William. Written in 1923, the English folk song suite includes 3 movements, and we're going to ask, please, that you hold your applause tonight until the third and final one has been played. 17 Come Sunday is the title of the first movement, followed by Intermezzo, My Bonnie Boy, and last, Folk Songs from Somerset. It's an absolutely delightful setting of folk songs which has been played by bands around the world for decades. Historically speaking, the piece is considered to be a cornerstone of the literature and one of the earliest serious works for wind band. Under the direction of the band's conductor, Don Jaramillio, enjoy this performance of English Folk Song Suite by Vaughan William. In just a moment, we'll welcome to the podium tonight's guest conductor, Jennifer Kirby. Your printed program includes biographical information on Ms. Kirby as well as Mr. Jaramillio, but allow me to offer this brief introduction before Jennifer comes on stage. As a conductor, Jennifer Kirby is well known and respected as a music educator. She served as director of bands in the Florence Carlton schools for the past 21 years. And now on the conductor's podium, she's a member of our bassoon section, obviously. So if she's ready, and I think she is, let's welcome Jennifer Kirby. 340 years ago, on this very date, March 31st of 1685, the most famous and gifted composer of all times, Johann Sebastian Bach, was born in Eisenach, Germany. It's appropriate then that we honor the great master by sharing one of his most iconic works tonight, Toccata and Fugue in D minor, as arranged for wind band. Originally composed for organ, it's since been rearranged for other musical media as well, including the symphony orchestra and the wind band. While some of the developmental sections have been deleted from the original score, arranger Victor Lopez has retained much of the lush and driven rendition of the original version. The Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. change of pace. Jennifer Kirby remains on the podium to conduct a second piece, this one titled Haven Dance. It's the first of 3 dance songs honoring the composer's children. Haven was David Holsinger's first child, who was 8 years old at the time this music was written, in 1983. His daughter served as the inspiration for this piece, as she was constantly dancing and twirling around the house, dreaming of being a ballerina. Keeping with our concert theme of songs and dances, let's enjoy together Haven Dance by David R. Holsinger. Before continuing with the musical portion of tonight's performance, I'd like to introduce the president of the Missoula Community Concert Band for some announcements at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, Tracy Hardy.
Thank you. I'm Tracy Hardy, I'm president of the community band. I just wanted to thank you all for coming tonight and then talk about a few things. Thank you for Tom Cook, just off the stage, for being our MC tonight. It's great to have him here. And big shout out to Don Jaramillio and our guest conductor, Jennifer Kirby, for being our wonderful director this spring. Putting together a concert for this group takes a lot of people, so I want to acknowledge our board, Amanda Tisch, Gretchen Schmitz, who is our secretary, our member representatives, John Combs, Gloria Handel, there's those two. Past President Brad Ellison, and we have a new president-elect for the next year, Andy Colson, and a new member at large elect, Carnegie, so we'll see that more next year. I also want to acknowledge our librarian, Don Gisselbeck, who's a member of our trombone section. He's the guy that's in charge of getting all these music folders ready for us at the beginning of the rehearsal season and then getting everything put away. Tiana Grisey, member of our flute section, has been managing our social media, so if you don't follow us on Facebook, get on there. She does some great posting. Big thanks to our percussion section and our other band members today that met at Seton High School at 3:30 to move all of our percussion equipment. And a shout out to Seton High School for letting us use their percussion and their band room for our rehearsal space this session. Thanks to MCAT, who's in the back there, also recording this. Okay. Now for the big announcement of the evening. If you have a program, hopefully you do, you have an insert in it. Little gray thing, it says Bingo with Bands. So, the Missoula Community Concert Band is partnering with the Missoula City Band in connection with the Missoula Kids Campaign, which happens in May. And we had a wild idea and decided to hold a bingo fundraiser. May 1st is the bingo fundraiser. The VFW on Main Street has generously offered us the use of their space for no charge, so thank you very much. There's a QR code on this flyer. You could use your phone and register there, or a computer and go to Missoula Band, www.missoulaband.org, you get home. Probably by 10 or 11 tonight, the site will be live on that webpage. But this is live right now. So if you register for bingo, we'd love to see you on May 1st. Come play bingo, where the band has gathered some fabulous prizes, so there'll be a prize for each of the 10 rounds of bingo. Now, there'll also be some music. Some of our chamber groups are going to play there that evening. Doors will open at 6, bingo starts at 7. Okay. If you have any questions about that, you can find me out in the lobby after the concert. So after the concert, feel free to join us for cookies. There'll be cookies and some drinks and a tuba case. Feel free to throw in cash, credit cards, checks, whatever you have in your pockets. There's also a virtual tuba case sign out there, so if you don't have any cash, if you use that QR code, you can also throw us some donations. Okay, thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the concert.
And now we welcome Don Jaramillio back to the stage as conductor of one of his own arrangements for band. And I've asked him to say a few words about this piece. Don?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. The Songs of Mexico, which is next on the program, is a series of popular Mexican songs which are arranged for the Missoula Community Band. And tonight, you are privileged to hear the premiere. Now, Mexicanos, which roughly translated is Pretty Little Mexican March. And the other march is Marcha Zacatecas, which is written in celebration of the state of Mexico, Zacatecas. You'll also hear three very identifiable folk songs. Guadalajara, which was written in celebration of the wonderful, rich tradition that Guadalajara has for the arts. You're going to hear Cielito Lindo, which roughly translated is Little Sweetheart, and you're going to hear John Combs on clarinet. You're going to hear Tiana Rosset on flute, and Kathy McCoy on oboe. And the last folk song we're going to play is very identifiable. You may not recognize the name. The title is Jarabe Tapatio, the actual tune that we all know it as the Mexican hat dance. My childhood, like many others in this fine ensemble, was filled with music. I remember attending family gatherings, hearing my grandmother, grandfather, aunts, uncles, my dad singing wonderful folk songs. This piece was written in their honor. I am forever grateful for their gift and passion for making music. Lastly, I'd like to thank the members of the community band for making this piece come alive. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy Songs of Mexico.
The Seal Lullaby was written by 55-year-old American composer Eric Whitacre, an award-winning conductor and creator of new music. Eric Whitacre wrote The Seal Lullaby in 2008, and it's based on a story by Rudyard Kipling titled The White Seal. It's dark and rich and not at all condescending to children, according to Whitacre. Best of all, Kipling begins his tale with the mother seal singing softly to her young pup. The opening poem of The White Seal is called The Seal Lullaby, from which this music derives its name. Band member Meg Carnegie is the piano soloist for this performance. Here is The Seal Lullaby by Eric Whitacre. Composer John Williams was asked by director Ron Howard to write the music for a motion picture called Far and Away. It's a fictionalized story, not really based on a true event or person, but the film uses real-life events of Irish immigrants seeking their fortune in America, with the Oklahoma land run of 1893 as a backdrop for its story. The music is typical John Williams, brassy, unabashedly romantic, and optimistic sound of an all-American art form. He startles you with the quality of his musical imagination, wrote Anthony Tommasini of the New York Times. Under the direction of Don Jaramillio, the Missoula Community Concert Band plays a suite of music taken from the score of Far and Away by John Williams and arranged for wind band by Paul Lavender. having you with us tonight. Thanks so much for coming. And don't forget the reception and the open instrument case out in the lobby. And we'll see you again in the fall for the next performance by the Missoula Community Concert Band. I'm Tom Cook, shamelessly promoting my radio program. Morning Classics on Montana Public Radio, which I host on Thursday and Friday, 9 to 11 a.m. I hope you'll tune in. The Chicago Tribune March is one of the most popular marches ever written by W. Paris Chambers. It's so distinctive with skillful interplay between melody and counter-melody and brilliant running woodwind parts. Let's all enjoy the Chicago Tribune March, written in 1892 and freshly transcribed and edited for a modern concert band by Mark Oliver. Thanks again for coming.